All right, if there are no questions, then we will start with today. Let me put on my presentation. All right, well, so what we're going to do is we're going to go back, kind of recover Chapter 3. It's often what I do in class as well. Sometimes students struggle with Chapter 3. It's not uncommon, so if you're struggling with Chapter 3, don't feel like you're the only one. There are plenty of people who struggle with this chapter. It's one of the reasons I go back through it, is because it's one of those chapters that students often struggle to understand, or they oftentimes get the opportunity cost reversed. So we'll try to go through today and we'll look at some examples. We'll go through the actual book example today, and we'll kind of go through where we should be and common mistakes that we might make. So the example from the book uses two goods, meat and potatoes, two people, rancher, farmer. So if you read the example in the book, it talks about if the rancher only produces meat, farmer only produces potatoes, they can both gain from trade. If both the rancher and farmer both produce meat and potatoes, they can still gain some specialization in trade. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through this example, and we're going to go through the numbers part. That's where most students struggle. And we're going to talk about kind of the comparative advantage, how we solve it, and some of the common issues we might have. So here's some of the information you need. It's referred to as the production tables. So we have on the left here is what is called the schedule. And on the right is sometimes referred to as the output. So on the left is the schedule. So before, it's what I need to make the good or service, sometimes also referred to as the input. So in order for the farmer to make meat, he's going to need 60 minutes. In order for the farmer to make potatoes, he's going to need 15 minutes. For the rancher, 20 minutes an ounce, and for her, potatoes are 10 minutes. So now what we're going to do is we'll look at the output for 8 hours. It doesn't matter what number you use for the output, because what we're more interested in is not necessarily the numbers, but the ratio. So if we look at output, we can see in 8 hours, farmers can produce 8 ounces of meat. Simply 8 hours divided, so 8 hours is 480 minutes divided by 60 minutes gets us our 8 ounces. Now for the rancher, same 480 minutes. For her, divided by 20, that equals 24, which is where that number comes from. And we would do the same thing to find the potatoes. You would take 480 divided by 10, very simple, that gets us the 48. So we can now see from our table how we get from our inputs to our outputs. Okay, if you worked the homework, you worked a little bit of this. It wasn't quite done this way, but it was done a different way. The homework will oftentimes present material slightly different than I have on the slides or in the presentations, to give you a different way to look at things. I try to give you a variety of ways to look at some things. Pick and choose which ones work best for you. Some people are going to like this way, some are going to like the homework way. Some are going to sometimes find their own way. Sometimes you find another video online and you like it that way. As long as we can come up with the correct answer, I'm not going to be picky about how you get there. In fact, I don't know how you get there. I have multiple choice questions. You have to come up with the answer. I'm just trying to provide you different ways to get there. So what we can then draw from this table we had before, so 8 and 32, give us our endpoint for the farmer. For the rancher, 24.48. Okay. Remember, this is what we call the production's possibilities frontier. This is what they can produce. And if there is no trade, well, what does that mean? Well, that means they can consume anywhere they'd like on that line. I just picked a point in the middle just to pick something. It doesn't matter. I could have easily picked something like this, which could have made it as 18 and 12. Could have picked 6 and 32. How do I come up with those numbers? I come up with those numbers very simple. I just use these output tables. And I said, well, if they devote a quarter of their time to potatoes and 3/4 of their time to meat, so they devote 2 hours to potatoes and 6 hours to meat. How much meat can they produce in 6 hours? Well, for the rancher, it's 18, and they can produce 12 potatoes in 2 hours. So this is just kind of talking about how we allocate time. So here, 8 hours for meat, 0 for potatoes. Here, it would be 6 hours for meat, and I devoted 2 hours for potatoes. So we just move along the table to solve for those. Okay, so all that does is just reallocate my 8 hours into different goods. Okay, we're not specializing here, we're just reallocating the time I have into different goods. And by reallocation, we move along the PPF. And since we made everything simple, we have constant opportunity cost. It's a straight line. Life works out easy. That's why we did it. So the same thing would work for the farmer, right? So if it was 6 hours for meat, 2 hours for potatoes, for the farmer, it would be 6 meat and 8 potatoes. So you can go through and find different points on the production's possibilities frontier with different combinations of time and how we allocate those times. There will be a quiz question, I think, about allocating times differently in different points on the curve. So please make sure you have some knowledge of that and go through that. Write it in your notes for examples. So here we struggle with coming up with this table. How do I get the opportunity cost table? So let's talk about this opportunity cost table. So let me add in a new slide. All right, so if we went back to our original table, right? So go back. Here's what we find for the farmer. So for the farmer, we go back to the output table. Meat, potatoes, 8, 32. For the rancher, 24, 48. So looking at this table, we can come up with some very quick information. First thing we can find is we can find something called the absolute advantage. Remember, we talked about it before. Who's better? So since they have the same amount of time, 8 hours, who can produce more meat? Well, that's simply the rancher. Who can produce more potatoes? Well, that's also the rancher. So we have this situation again where the rancher is better at everything, is richer than the farmer. However, we talk about that there's this ability to trade, and it's going to come about through the opportunity cost. So the opportunity cost we want to find. So let's start with the farmer. It's a different color to help you. Let's start with the farmer. So the farmer can either do 8 meat, take the endpoints, 8 meat, or 32 potatoes. So pick the endpoints. If you're looking at the PPF, you take the meat endpoint, take this one, and this one. There they are. So now how do I find what it cost me? Well, I want to know, what does one meat cost? Well, how do I get from 8 to 1? Well, very simple. I divide by 8. So I take 8 and I divide it by 8, gets me my 1 meat. What I do to one side, I have to do to the other side. So it should give us the 4 potatoes. If we wanted to find potatoes, well, I want to get 1 potato equals, well, how do I get to 1? Is I divide by 32. And that's how I would end up with my equation there. So when we do the opportunity cost, the easiest way is take the endpoints. Take the numbers on the max output table here and simply write the equation. That's the way I found to be the easiest for me, is you can just simply write the equation, solve the numbers. So when I'm working the test, and this was my scratch paper, this is exactly what my scratch paper would look like. And then I would have the rancher underneath it. I just ran out of space on the screen. But then I would do the exact same thing for the rancher. I would do 24 equals 48. I would do 1 meat equals, it's going to be 2 potatoes and 1 potato for half a meat. I would take those numbers and I would create a table that looks just like this and write opportunity cost on it. And then whatever question that was asked of me on the test, I now have the information to be able to answer it. So if I was asked then, well, who has the comparative advantage in meat? Well, I would simply look at the table here and go 2 is less than 4. I would know the answer is the rancher. I would look at potatoes. Who's got the smallest cost? That's the farmer. So that should match up. So now that I know what they specialize in, then I can go forward. I talk about the farmer specializing in potatoes, the rancher in cattle, meat. And now I have to find a trade. How do I know, again, what trade works? Well, we do it the same way we always did. So 5 equals 15. What does 1 cost? 1 cost 3 potatoes. So is that a good trade? Well, I would go back and look at and see that 3 falls between 4 and 2. If we did this, I could accept anywhere from 10 to 20 potatoes, and it would still be a beneficial trade. Because that's anywhere from 1 equals 2 to 1 meat equals 4 is acceptable. Always go back to the base ratio. Yes, Amber, for the comparative advantage, it is the smaller number. But when we find this trade, we always want to go back to that opportunity cost, and we see, here's our opportunity cost table. And as long as our ratio is in between these two ratios, we're good. Now, if it said 5 ounces of meat for 25 ounces of potatoes, the answer to that is no, they both wouldn't benefit from trade. So we only benefit when trade is in between those numbers. And when that happens, and we make this trade, so our trade is really, think about it, 1 meat for 3 potatoes. So what I did here is I went through and created a situation. So what I did is I picked a situation where the farmer does nothing but produce potatoes. And the rancher, she produces a combination just because that's what I decided. And so with this combinations, how do we get to this new point, point A? Well, if you think about it, our trade is 5 meats for 15 potatoes. So if the farmer traded away 15 potatoes, so 32 minus 15 gets us their 17. And they gained 5 meat. So we would move up to this new point A. And in fact, if you think about it, if the farmer traded away all his potatoes for meat, he could get 10 2/3 ounces, assuming the rancher would be willing to give up all that meat. And so if you look at it, that's really the new consumption's possibilities frontier with this price. So what you can see is that with trade, the farmer now has the ability to consume more than he could have consumed before. Now for the rancher, we did 18 and 12, just picked a point. And if we subtract away the 5 meat, that gets us to 13. We add in the 15 potatoes, that gets us to 27. We were to draw this point, we see it's beyond the production's possibilities frontier. And in fact, if we could keep this same ratio, and let's say the farmer saved up potatoes for quite a long time, we could do 24 times 3, which would be 72. So we could actually draw where the new consumption's possibilities frontier would be with this new price. Now, again, I know the farmer doesn't have 72 potatoes at the moment, but if he saved up, maybe he could get to 72 and make a trade for 24 meat. And we could see then that we could maximize what we can consume. We can get more for both people. Again, as long as we're between 1 meat and 2 potatoes and 1 meat and 4 potatoes. So this is probably a very similar table to probably what you saw in your homework. I just filled it out. So with trade, without trade, this is what we could get to. Right? That was the middle. I just picked it in the middle just to be kind of easy. So with trade, the farmer devoted all of his time to potatoes, The rancher specialized more in meat, still made a little bit of potatoes because she still wants a little bit of potatoes. We don't have to completely specialize to benefit in trade. We can specialize a little bit, if we'll talk about that way. So here, the rancher just devotes more resources to meat and less to potatoes. Not all of it. We don't need all of it to work. We just need more resources going to certain industries based on comparative advantage. So then here's our trade. I get 5. I give 15, so 32 minus 15 gets us to 7. I give 5, so I take 8 minus 5, gives us 13. 12 plus 15 gives us to 27. Now what I do is I compare this number to this number. I gain in meat, I gain in potatoes, I gain in meat, I gain in potatoes. So hopefully that's a little closer to maybe what you were struggling with on the homework. If you were struggling with on the homework, that just kind of goes through the example of what to do. You'll see a similar question to this on your quiz. I know there'll be a quiz question like this that you'll have to fill out the table. Now, I don't know if I use farmer or rancher. I don't remember which 2 people I use or 2 goods. It doesn't matter. We just go through, we can solve and look at how to solve it using this table. So kind of some, I call them little snippets of it, things I would write down to make sure I knew about comparative and absolute advantage. Just kind of some rules to live by. So if we talked about one person, it's possible, we talked about before, that they can have the comparative advantage in both goods. It's possible that I am the best at everything, but it is not possible for me to have the comparative advantage in both goods. I can be the best, but I can't always have the lowest cost. I know that doesn't necessarily fit with what you think about the world, but we've shown that that's kind of could be how it works. I could be the best at everything, but it doesn't mean I have the lowest cost. So because of that, one person has a comparative advantage in one good, then the other person must have it in the other good. Right? That's kind of what reciprocals mean. Right? The opportunity cost of one good is simply the inverse of the opportunity cost of the other good, right? They're reciprocals. Back to our old math days. We gain from trade because of comparative advantage. And because of this comparative advantage, it increases the size of the pie. So everyone, or at least the country as a whole, is better off. So here's some more things to go through. Trade can benefit everyone. It allows us to specialize. We talked about where the price of trade must lie between the 2 opportunity costs. And so we can talk about why we are interdependent and why we have gains from trade. So why we have interdependence and why we have gains from trade. So now let's kind of talk about it kind of on a practical point, or let's talk about it kind of how we see it in politics. And so let's start with, we'll pick the United States because that's the country we are in. I guess you guys could be anywhere now, but I'm assuming most of you still live in the United States and aren't taking this class from overseas, but I guess it's possible now since it's online. But we'll assume we're all in the United States. And so let's talk about the relationship between the U.S. and other countries. And let's talk about some of the issues that come about. You've probably, if you've paid attention to politics, you've seen these issues come about, and we're going to talk about them. And we're going to talk about kind of the ideas behind it and why there's discussion and some animosity towards it. I try to be as apolitical as possible, but again, this is macro. We're going to deal into politics. I try to speak as a pure economist. I try to be almost as pure as here's what economics says. Probably more on the efficient side on my focus. I try to make sure I cover both. The goal of this is not to learn what Dr. Walshite thinks about politics, okay, but we're trying to look at it from pure economic theory. Again, you're going to make your own decisions about the world. Economics is part of your understanding about the world. So we're going to put this tool into play. So the first thing you should know are what imports and exports are. Imports are goods that I buy from other countries. Exports are goods that I sell to other countries. So I export what I specialize in. Right? This is where I have the lowest opportunity cost. This is where my comparative advantage lies. So I export goods that we have the comparative advantage in. And I import goods that we do not have the comparative advantage in. So because of the specialization, all countries experience greater prosperity. As we have opened up the world to trade, we'll talk about it again later, we have seen this huge growth in the world, in living standards. When does trade not work? There are opportunities when trade does not work. Trade doesn't work under two conditions. Sorry, I only gave you one here. Condition one, trade doesn't work when the opportunity costs are exactly the same. If we went and we were all exactly identical, then we wouldn't have any comparative advantages over one another. And if we wouldn't have any comparative advantages, then we wouldn't specialize. So the one way that trade doesn't work is if everyone is the same. And I think you have enough experience in this world to understand is that we are all different. Amber, to answer your question, sorry, I have to toggle back and forth every now and then. We always export the good we have the comparative advantage in. The one we have the lowest cost, correct. That's the one we export. It doesn't matter which one we're better at producing or which one we produce more of. We focus only on the cost side of it. So we look at the comparative advantage, and whatever one we have the comparative advantage in is the one we export. Because remember, we could be better at making both goods, but we export only the good that we have the comparative advantage in. And if there are no comparative advantages, then there's nothing to trade. We can't take advantage of specialization. And the second way when trade doesn't work, so if we go back to our farmer and our rancher, and we talk about the farmer is a vegetarian, he doesn't want meat. So there's no way to benefit from trade, because what would happen is the farmer just produces all the potatoes, and it doesn't matter what price they offer for meat, the farmer doesn't want it. So that works in a very simplistic world where there's only two goods. But when we expand to lots and lots of goods, the likelihood of you not having what I want comes to almost zero. So again, when we put more and more people in the world, these two reasons go away. But we can find exceptions to the rule if we look at very, very simplistic examples, right? Where there's only two people and they're identical twins, and that means they do everything exactly the same, which isn't even true of identical twins. But that would be kind of how we would make trade not work. So yes, there are ways around it, but it almost will always work for a country. So why don't we like trade? So what I have here in quotations are the common arguments against trade. probably the biggest argument against trade is that trade with other countries destroys domestic jobs. So if we were looking back, we'll just say we're the rancher because we're the United States. We're richer than most countries. So if we went back and we looked at the rancher with meat and potatoes. So what happens when the rancher engages in trade? Well, when the rancher engages in trade, or the United States engages in trade, we're going to produce more meat and less potatoes. So that means there's less jobs available here, but more jobs here. So as a whole, it actually works out as plus jobs. For the country as a whole, it's good, right? Free trade does create jobs, but it also destroys them. And total unemployment does not rise as imports rise, because jobs lost in one industry are gained in the other. Now, this is kind of a sticking point, because at least if you think about the United States, is that certain areas of the country might produce potatoes, while a different area of the country produces meat. So if I'm a politician and I represent a potato industry area, I might not be in favor of free trade because the people in my sector are going to be hurt. And if I'm in the meat area, I'm probably all for free trade because it's going to create expansion in my area. So we can sometimes see if a politician is looking out for some people over the others, is that they're worried about maybe the potato industry and the meat industry is going to gain. In the United States, it's been an issue. We have comparative advantages, just like all other countries. We have comparative advantages in the United States, and usually things that involve it's not necessarily intelligence, but I will refer to it as I will call it brain power for no better term than I got. It's going to involve goods and services that require a lot of thought. Computer software, designing products. It could be movies, things that we do that involve thought and process. We don't have the comparative advantage in what we call a lot of things that involve a lot of, it's not to be disparaging of it, but hard work. Something that's what we call a simple task. Putting things together, snapping things together, yes, it's hard work and it takes a lot of time to snap two things together, but it's a relatively simple task. It costs us too much in resources we could devote to other goods that we send these goods or these jobs are typically done overseas. Well, these jobs are typically where we have the comparative advantage and where we create and where our comparative advantage is. So as we've imported more goods, if you look at the unemployment rate really hasn't changed. Well, because we've substituted goods or jobs from the hard work area into a little more brain power in the area. And probably the best example of this is if you look at your Apple phones. Apple does a very kind of, I don't know if it's a good job, but they do a very good job of explaining how the product comes about. If you ever look at your Apple phone, it will say something usually as something, usually they used to say designed in the United States, assembled in China. Most of the most expensive part of your Apple phone actually isn't the components. In fact, I could give you the components for your Apple phone, and it'd probably cost you $20. Your Apple phone probably has $20 worth of components. But if I gave you all those pieces, how many of you could design a phone with those pieces? Well, probably not very many of us. That's where the US has a comparative advantage, is creating the design to make our phones work. And then what we do is we don't have the comparative advantage in like assembly, so we send the instructions overseas and they assemble the products. Now the problem, or where we see problem in the United States, is we used to assemble goods here. And someone who assembled, say, they probably didn't assemble iPhones, but they assembled goods here in the United States. Now that job has went overseas. And when that job goes overseas, what do we do with this person? Is they no longer they can't just all of a sudden go from assembling Apple phones to designing them. It doesn't work like that. We know it doesn't work like that. So how do we try to accomplish that? It's very difficult for people who lose their jobs due to trade going overseas. We can see it, as they just can't up and move into one industry. Why I stress to students that you're always going to have to be learning in the United States. You don't want to. I understand that. I don't want to either. But we're always going to have to be learning of new ways to do things and to get better at them. Because what's going to happen is our comparative advantage in the world might change. And if it's changing, we want to make sure that we can go from assembly to design, or at least be trying to move that way. The jobs will be available, but we have to make sure that we're able to get there. So one of the issues I like to talk about, and we talk about the jobs argument, what if I, instead of talking about trade, I came up with a different story? And I'm not going to talk about trade. I'm going to talk about magic fairy dust. So I developed this awesome magic fairy dust. And what this magic fairy dust does is I sprinkle it on some wheat, and poof, I get a car. So if you give me 100 bushels of wheat, then I can go into my lab, because I came up with this great idea about how to do this, and I have this magic dust, and I take my magic dust and I sprinkle it on wheat, and boom, I get a car. Well, who liked that idea? Boy, I get cars from just 100 bushels of wheat, everyone would sign up. Right, that's a great invention, Dr. Walsh. How did you revolutionize the world? Well, here's how I revolutionized the world. I just took a giant boat, took the wheat to China, and China sent me back a car. So what's the difference in my story? The difference in my story is there is no difference. Trade and technology both what we call is destroy jobs. There are very few people who frown upon technology making my life better. What trade does as well, but very few people will frown on the technology part, while a lot of people will frown on the trade part. They're one and the same. There's this idea, and it was created by Joseph Schumpeter back in 1942. He refers to it as creative destruction. Refers to the incessant product and process innovation mechanism by which new production units replace outdated ones. What that really means is there'll be jobs created and jobs destroyed continuously. And this process has only sped up through the years now. It has just gotten bigger and bigger as time has gone on. So we see more of creative destruction. For the history people, there is a wonderful term that is referred to as a Luddite. Does anyone happen to know what a Luddite is? Don't look it up. Does anyone know what a Luddite is without looking it up on their phone? Doesn't look like anyone knows, but that is truly what we call people who are against technological progress. So people who are against technological progress are called Luddites. And if you have time, you can go read the history of General Ludd. Well, I don't know if he's actually a general. Don't even know if it's really a person. But you can read about the Luddite Revolution. And here's the funniest part about the Luddite Revolution. Guess what they were against? They were against the loom. Why were they against the loom? Well, it allowed us to weave cotton into clothes a whole lot faster than if they did it by hand. So when we created this loom, it put a lot of those tailors out of business. And when those tailors were out of business, they lost their job. So what they did is they ran around the country smashing looms. Now, as a society, I am a lot happier that the loom was invented. I get a whole lot more clothes in my closet than we could before. All right, the whole clothing industry is happy about that. But if you were one of those people who lost their jobs, you probably were not. So there will always be this creative destruction in the world. And it's always important that we recognize that there will be changes in how things are done. My job will never be the same. It will always continuously change. Doesn't matter what work you do. So you need to make sure that you're always innovating and learning. You'll hear that throughout probably your college career, and that's why, because we have this creative destruction that is occurring, and we don't want to try to be left behind. Second reason for against trade is this industry is vital for national security. There probably are some. You can see it right now. Now I'm going to misspell their name, but if you look at it with discussions about China, and if you're paying attention to the United States, and they talk about banning Huawei, restricting trade. So we're restricting trade from a Chinese company because we're worried about national security. We're worried about safety. And now there probably is some validity to that argument. But oftentimes if we use this argument, we take it to the absurdity. Well, an army needs clothes in order to protect our country. And since we need clothes to protect our country, shouldn't we protect apparel makers to make sure we always have clothes for our army? Well, I guess. But you could use that argument for national security is it should be rare rather than common. So there probably is some rare occurrences where it is important to restrict trade. Thankfully, other countries don't do it as much because we actually have a comparative advantage in national security apparatuses. We're very good at making missiles, planes, a lot of things for war. That's where our comparative advantage is because it's high technology, high brain power, so we export a lot of military helicopters, military jets, military ammunition, because it now requires a lot of high levels of technology. We don't export a lot of simple bullets. If they're more advanced, that's where our comparative advantage is. Third one. This one is for history people. If you pay attention, there is some discussion. If you go back, and you can go back after the American Revolution, they talked about restricting trade. And they did restrict trade. Again, if you're a history major, it created a lot of strife between parts of the country because of trade restrictions. You can write arguments about this was a huge impact for the formation of the United States and some of the problems we had for years. If we go back to when the United States first started, we were good at the hard work things that required a lot of labor. Whether that's good or bad, but that's where our comparative advantage was. And we were not very good at things that required technology and brain. And a lot of the manufacturing and those kind of industries were in the north, and a lot of the labor-intensive industries were in the south. And what we argued in the United States at the time is that we needed trade restrictions to help these industries in the north. And when we did that, it restricted exports of our goods in the south. And so what we had is this discussion in American history over really the infant industry argument. And it works if you want to protect some certain industries. It's easy to protect industries to maybe they'll grow and become a comparative advantage. But the problem is, I refer to them as the United States isn't a very good parent. As parents, at some point we have to let our children grow up and be out on their own. It's a very difficult thing for us to do as parents. Now, some of you are the children part, you want to grow out and be on your own. But we want to protect you forever. You probably have some parents that are like that. And it's hard for us to let you go. Just like it is hard for you to go and for your parents to let you go, at some point we need to let you grow on your own. And there are some economists who argue you don't even need protection. Industries will grow if we have the comparative advantage without protection. And they have. People are intelligent and smart and creative, and they will find ways to make the industry grow. Now, this one is probably my favorite. As these last two are unfair competition and protection as a bargaining chip. I won't trade with you unless you take away all your unfair rules and you trade with me. So I don't like what you're doing, so I'm going to try to punish you. And since you don't like that I'm doing that with you, we have this back and forth of no one's going to trade with anyone. We do this a lot. Okay, we do this through what sometimes they refer to as sanctions. Now, this protection as a bargaining chip, as a way to do international business, is a game I typically refer to as trading licks. Yes, Taylor, that would be the argument of why industry has a difficult time, is industries always believe they need protection or restrictions. So has anyone ever played the game Trading Licks? All right, I know you guys are lying. I know some of you have. Typically, this is a game played by boys. There are girls that sometimes play this game as well. So Trading Licks is typically, it's usually two young boys get together and they see who's, I know it's a little sexist of a language, they want to see who the bigger man is. So what do? Is they hit each other on the shoulder to see who cries first. Now, what ends up happening with this game? What's the outcome of that game? Two boys who have bruises on their shoulders. Just like little boys, countries do it as well. And they do it through trade. So what happens is, this trade can be beneficial to both countries. However, they sometimes behave like little children and they hit each other on the arm to see who the bigger person is, who can inflict more damage. And I guess if you can inflict more damage, you can impose your policy. The U.S. likes to do this. It's, I guess, preferable rather than war, is you just leave each other bruised. But we see this a lot, and it works a lot as we're just trying to hit each other to see if we can get the other one to stop or to cry. All right, are there any questions then about chapter 3? I tried to go through almost everything that I could.